The glass walls of the Park Global Tower were designed to be invisible, yet to Kyung-soo Park, they felt like the bars of a cage. At 71, he stood at the apex of the South Korean economy, a man whose subtle nod could shift markets and whose silence could end careers. Outside, Seoul was a neon-veined organism thrumming with life. Inside his office, the air was filtered, chilled, and dead. "Father, you haven't even looked at the portfolio." Minho's voice cut through the silence like a dull blade. Kyung-soo didn't turn away from the window. Behind him, his son and daughter sat at a mahogany conference table, strewn with high-gloss photographs. They weren't photos of acquisition targets or real estate ventures. They were women. "Mrs. Choi is a widow of impeccable standing," his daughter, Seo Yeon, added, her voice soft but insistent. "She is quiet. She practices traditional calligraphy, and her family owns half of the textile manufacturing in Daegu. She would be a dignified companion." Dignified? Kyung-soo tasted the word and found it bitter. To his children, dignified meant invisible. They didn't want a mother. They wanted a placeholder who wouldn't interfere with the inheritance or the company's public image. "I am not a museum piece in need of a matching set, Minho," Kyung-soo said, his voice a low, dry rasp. "You are the chairman," Minho countered, standing up. "The public expects a stable family unit. It's been 20 years, Father. You're becoming a hermit in a three-piece suit. People are talking." Kyung-soo finally turned. His eyes were like polished flint. "Let them talk. I am going away for a month. No meetings, no portfolios, and if I see another photograph of a quiet widow upon my return, I will fire the both of you from the board." The SS Sovereign was an ostentatious display of wealth that Kyung-soo would normally despise, but its anonymity was its greatest asset. On this ship, he wasn't the chairman of Park Global. He was simply passenger 402, a man in a charcoal overcoat who spoke to no one. 3 days into the voyage, the hollowness he had brought from Seoul began to ache. He couldn't sleep. The luxury of the suite felt like a velvet, cold box. At 3 a.m., he climbed to the highest observation deck. The Mediterranean night was a deep, bruised purple. The wind was cold, biting through his silk shirt, but he welcomed the sting. It was the only thing that felt real. He thought he was alone until he saw a glow. The amber tip further down the railing. "It's a lot of pressure, isn't it?" The voice was unexpected. It was thick and melodic, like honey mixed with gravel, carrying the unmistakable soul of the American East Coast. Kyung-soo stiffened, his professional guard instinctively rising. "I beg your pardon?" "The stars," she said. She was a silhouette against the darkness, draped in a heavy cashmere wrap the color of midnight. "They're up there doing all that burning and shining just so we can look at them and feel small. It's a lot of work for a ball of gas." Kyung-soo relaxed just a fraction. He stepped closer, leaning his elbows on the cold teak railing. "I find their indifference comforting. They don't want anything from me." "Ah!" She let out a short, knowing laugh. "A man who is tired of being a gold mine. I know that tune. I've been humming it my whole life." He looked at her then. Even in the shadows, she was striking. Her skin was a deep, rich sable, her hair a cloud of silver strands that caught the faint light of the moon. She didn't look like the women his children pushed toward him. She didn't look quiet. She looked like a monument. "Gold is heavy," Kyung-soo remarked, surprised by his own sudden urge to speak. "People think wealth is a wing that helps you fly. They don't realize it's actually a weight that keeps you pinned to the ground." "It's an anchor," she agreed, turning her head to meet his gaze. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and entirely unimpressed by him. And the bigger the anchor, the harder it is to see the ocean. You spend all your time worrying about the chain, making sure it's polished, making sure it doesn't rust, and you forget you're on a boat that's supposed to be moving. Kyung-soo felt a strange tectonic shift in his chest. For 40 years, he had been the one giving the metaphors, the one leading the parables. "I have spent my life building a cage out of that chain," he confessed. "We all do," she said softly. "The trick is remembering that you're the one who holds the key. Most people die waiting for someone else to unlock the door, but at our age, we should know better." They stood in silence for a long time, watching the white foam of the wake vanish into the dark sea. No names were exchanged. No business cards were produced. In the vacuum of the 3 a.m. wind, they weren't icons of industry. They were just two tired architects of their own loneliness. "The sun will be up in 2 hours," he said. "Then I suggest you enjoy the dark while it lasts," she replied, giving him a small, enigmatic tilt of her head. "It's the only time we get to be invisible." She turned and walked away, her wrap fluttering behind her like a royal cape. Kyung-soo stayed at the railing, his heart beating with a rhythm he hadn't felt in decades. He didn't know her name, but for the first time in 20 years, the suit he wore didn't feel like a shroud. The sun over Sicily was an arrogant gold, bleaching the ancient limestone of Syracuse until the city seemed to glow from within. Kyung-soo found her sitting at a small, wobbly table in a piazza that smelled of roasting espresso and salt air. She was wearing a cream silk linen shirt and oversized sunglasses, looking entirely at home against the backdrop of crumbling Baroque cathedrals. She didn't look up when he approached. She was busy marking a financial newspaper with a fountain pen. "I didn't think I would see you in the light," Kyung-soo said, pulling out the chair opposite her. "The dark seemed to suit you." Beatrice pushed her glasses down her nose, her amber eyes sparkling with a challenge. "The light is for seeing things clearly, Mr. Park. And I see you've traded your charcoal overcoat for Italian silk. It's a good look, less like a funeral, more like a resurrection." "You know my name," he noted, a small smile playing on his lips. "I'm a researcher by trade," she replied smoothly, folding the paper. "And you aren't exactly a well-kept secret. Chairman of Park Global, the man who bought the Port of Busan with a handshake and a stare. But don't worry, I'm not here for an autograph." They spent the afternoon wandering through the Neapolis Archaeological Park. While other tourists marveled at the Greek theater, Beatrice and Kyung-soo found themselves debating the economics of the ancient world. "The Greeks understood leverage," Kyung-soo remarked, gesturing to the massive stone structures. "They built monuments to their gods to convince their enemies they had divine backing. It's the same in modern Seoul. You build a tower to prove you are too big to fail." Beatrice stopped in the shadow of an olive tree that looked 1,000 years old. "That's where you're wrong, Kyung-soo. That's a great man philosophy, and it's outdated. You build towers because you're afraid of the ground. Real power isn't a monument. It's the ability to disappear and still have the gears turn without you. If your empire needs you to be the sun, then your empire is one rainy day away from a blackout." Kyung-soo bristled. No one had spoken to him like this in 30 years. A company requires a singular vision. Without the head, the body dies. "Only if the body is a puppet," she countered, her voice dropping into a register of pure, corporate steel. "A true leader builds a nervous system. I stepped away from my firm 3 years ago. I haven't stepped foot in the office since. Yet my profit margins increased by 12% last quarter. Why? Because I didn't build a monument to Beatrice Wright. I built an ecosystem." Kyung-soo fell silent. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the way she carried herself, not as a woman on vacation, but as a general in civilian clothes. She wasn't a tourist who had happened upon success. She was a strategist who moved the world from the shadows. They ended the day at a restaurant perched on a cliffside in Ortigia. The Ionian Sea churned below them, turning a bruised violet as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The dinner was a dance of revelations. As the wine, a deep, volcanic red, poured, the professional mask began to slip, revealing the raw human hunger beneath. "What do you hate most?" she asked, leaning over the candlelit table. "Not market volatility or bad policy. What makes you want to walk out of a room?" Kyung-soo didn't hesitate. "Sycophants, the men who agree with me before I finished my sentence. My children have surrounded me with them. They think they are protecting me, but they are just suffocating me in a room full of yes." Beatrice laughed, a rich, resonant sound that seemed to vibrate in the wine glasses. "For me, it's boredom, the predictable luxury, the people who think that because they have money, they no longer need to have a soul. I spent my life in D.C., surrounded by people who were important, but none of them were interesting. They were all just variations of the same script." "We are a rare breed, Beatrice," Kyung-soo said, his voice low. The chemistry between them wasn't the frantic heat of a first date. It was the slow, steady burn of a forge. Two people who have reached the top of the mountain only to find that the view is lonely and the air is thin. "So why stay on the mountain alone?" she whispered. She reached across the table, her hand resting near his. The air between them felt charged, a physical pressure that made the rest of the restaurant fade into a blur of noise and light. Kyung-soo looked at her hand, strong and steady, and then at his own, weathered by decades of war. He realized he didn't want to debate her business philosophy anymore. He wanted to see how her world looked when it collided with his. "I think," Kyung-soo said, his eyes locked onto hers, "that my children are going to be very, very disappointed." "Good," Beatrice replied, her smile sharp and beautiful. "I've always found that disappointment is the best way to wake people up." The sky over the Mediterranean didn't just darken, it bruised. By midnight, the SS Sovereign was no longer a palace of glass. It was a toy in the hands of a violent, churning sea. The ship groaned, a deep metallic wail that echoed through the corridors as 30-foot swells hammered the hull. In the grand lounge, the crystal chandeliers swung like pendulums of doom. Most passengers had retreated to their cabins to pray or succumb to seasickness, but in the far corner, tucked into a velvet booth that seemed anchored to the soul of the ship, sat Kyung-soo and Beatrice. Between them sat a heavy crystal decanter of hibiki and 2 glasses. They were the only ones not looking at the emergency exits. "The captain sounds nervous on the intercom," Kyung-soo remarked as the ship took a particularly steep roll. He caught the decanter before it could slide off the table, his movements practiced and calm. "Captains are paid to be nervous. We're paid to stay upright," Beatrice replied. She took a slow sip of her whiskey, her eyes fixed on the black chaos outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I've survived 3 market crashes and a hostile takeover by the Russian mob. A little water isn't going to finish me." Kyung-soo watched her. The lightning outside flickered, casting her regal profile in stark relief. "You have no one waiting for you to call? No one at home counting the hours until the storm passes?" Beatrice set her glass down. The ice clinked, a small, sharp sound against the roar of the gale. "No. I made a choice a long time ago, Kyung-soo. In my world, you could be a mother or you could be a mogul. You couldn't be both. Not the way I wanted to be. I chose the legacy of glass and steel. I chose the buildings with my name on the deed and the thousands of families who eat because I signed their paychecks." She looked at him, her gaze unflinching. "People call it cold. They say I missed out on the greatest joy. But I look at the skyline of D.C. and I see my children. They're made of concrete and light, and they don't talk back." "And the silence at night?" Kyung-soo asked softly. "Is the concrete enough to keep you warm?" Beatrice's expression softened, a rare crack in the armor. "The silence is the price. I paid it willingly. But sometimes, in the quiet between the deals, I wonder if I built a kingdom just to have a place to hide. Kyung-soo leaned back, the shadows of the lounge deepening around him. I chose the other path. I gave my wife everything, the house, the title, the children. But I never gave her the truth. I was so busy being the chairman that I forgot to be her husband. She died 20 years ago, and my greatest grief isn't that she's gone. It's that she died without ever knowing the man who sat across from her at dinner every night. He looked at his hands, the knuckles white. My children love the chairman. They worship the bank account, but they don't know me, Beatrice. To them, I am just a legacy in waiting. The ship shuddered as a massive wave slammed into the port side. Somewhere in the kitchen, china shattered. Beatrice didn't flinch. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, a living contrast to the cold storm outside. Then we're both ghosts, Kyung-soo, she whispered. 2 ghosts haunting a very expensive ship. Maybe, Kyung-soo said, his fingers intertwining with hers. But ghosts don't feel this much heat. The storm raged on, the world outside dissolving into a liquid abyss. But inside the lounge, the silence was finally broken. They didn't talk of business or empires. They talked of the things they had buried under the gold. The art they loved, the music that made them weep, and the terrifying realization that at 70 and 71, they were finally, for the first time, being seen. The morning after the storm was unnervingly quiet. The Mediterranean had retreated into a shimmering turquoise mirror, hiding the violence of the night beneath a mask of serene indifference. As the SS Sovereign glided toward the rugged, sun-drenched coastline of Marseille, the mechanical hum of the thrusters signaled the end of the dream. Kyung-soo stood on the private observation deck, watching the tugboat swarm the massive ship like ants guiding a whale. For the first time in his life, the sight of land didn't bring a sense of arrival. It brought a sense of dread. He thought of the Seoul airport. He thought of the black sedan that would whisk him away to the glass tower, where his children would be waiting with more photographs of suitable women and more spreadsheets of dignified lives. You look like a man watching his own execution, Beatrice said, leaning against the doorway. She was dressed for the shore, a sharp ivory linen suit and gold hoops that caught the morning light. She looked ready to conquer a continent. Kyung-soo turned to her. The air between them was thick with the weight of everything they had shared in the dark. I have realized that I cannot go back to being a statue, Beatrice. I have spent a month breathing. I don't think my lungs can handle the vacuum of soul anymore. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the teak deck. He didn't have a diamond ring tucked in his pocket. He didn't have a rehearsed speech. He had something much more raw. My house is a tomb, he said, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that would have horrified his board of directors. It is filled with expensive things and people who are waiting for me to die so they can inherit the furniture. I don't want a companion who will sit by my side like a statue. I want a partner who will help me burn the house down. He took her hands in his. Come to Seoul. Be my wife. Not because I am lonely, but because I am finally awake and I refuse to fall back asleep. Beatrice didn't pull away, but she didn't melt into his arms. She stepped back just enough to look him directly in the eye, her expression becoming something formidable, something ancient. Kyung-soo, look at me, she commanded. Really look at me. I am a 70-year-old black woman from the south side of Chicago who clawed her way to the top of the D.C. food chain. I have more scars than your children have achievements. I don't fit in a palace. I don't do tea ceremonies where I'm expected to keep my head down and my mouth shut. She tightened her grip on his hands, her voice dropping into a low, resonant rumble. Your children want a quiet widow. They want a soft place for your legacy to land. But you have to understand, I am the storm. I am loud, I am opinionated, and I have a business empire of my own that I will not abandon for the sake of your family's comfort. If I go to Seoul, I am not coming as your ornament or your +1. I am coming as a sovereign." She leaned in, her forehead almost touching his. "If you bring me into that glass fortress of yours, the windows are going to shatter. The culture will clash. Your children will hate me before they even know my name. Can you handle a wife who is more powerful than your board of directors?" Kyung-soo felt a wild, terrifying joy surge through him. He didn't see a foreigner or a stranger. He saw the only person who had ever been his match. "Beatrice," he whispered, a predatory glint returning to his eyes. "I've spent my life building windows. I think it's about time someone shattered them." He kissed her then. Not a gentle kiss of old age, but a fierce, desperate pact. As the ship's whistle blasted, announcing their arrival in France, the chairman of Park Global and the ghost of DC stood together on the deck, two titans preparing for a war they intended to win together. The secret Eden was over. The revolution had begun. The descent into Incheon International Airport was a plunge into a world of brushed steel and geometric precision. From the window of the private Gulf Stream, Seoul appeared as a sprawling grid of white and gray, a city that functioned with the rhythmic, cold heartbeat of a supercomputer. Kyung-soo watched Beatrice. She was dressed in a suit of deep electric cobalt, a color that seemed to vibrate against the muted leather of the plane's interior. She wasn't nervous. She was calibrating. "They will be waiting at the estate," Kyung-soo said, his voice a low warning. "My sister, Mi-sun, will be there too. She is the keeper of the Park Standard. She has spent 40 years polishing the family name until it reflects nothing but her own face." Beatrice applied a layer of deep plum lipstick, her reflection in a gold-handled compact steady. "Let her polish. I've always found that the more someone polishes a surface, the more they're trying to hide the cracks underneath." The Park estate sat on the slopes of Namesan, a fortress of granite walls and silent pine trees. As the black sedan wound up the driveway, the visual contrast Beatrice brought with her became a physical force. The house was a masterpiece of chaebol minimalism, vast expanses of gray stone, floor-to-ceiling glass that revealed nothing, and a staff that moved like shadows. There was no art on the walls that wasn't approved by a curator. There were no flowers that weren't white lilies. Waiting on the heated stone steps were Minho and Seo-yeon. They stood perfectly straight, their black suits sharp enough to cut, their expressions schooled into masks of filial piety. Beside them stood Aunt Mi-sun, her handbag a pale, ghostly gray, her hands folded over her silk sash. The car door opened. Kyung-soo stepped out first, but he didn't wait for the greeting. He reached back and took Beatrice's hand. As Beatrice stepped inside, the silence of the estate was punctuated by the clack of her stilettos. In her cobalt suit, with her silver strand hair shimmering in the Seoul sun and her skin a beautiful, unapologetic obsidian, she looked like a splash of ink on a pristine white canvas. The shock on the children's faces was visceral. It wasn't just that she was a foreigner. It was her gravity. They had expected a girlfriend, someone they could dismiss as a temporary lapse in their father's judgment. They had prepared for a woman who would be intimidated by the scale of their wealth. Instead, they were looking at a woman who looked like she owned the mountain the house was built on. "Father," Minho began, his voice tight, his eyes darting to Beatrice's hand in Kyung-soo's. You didn't mention your guest would be of American descent." "She is not a guest, Minho," Kyung-soo said, his voice echoing off the granite walls. "She is the woman I am going to marry. This is Beatrice Wright." Seo-yeon's mouth opened slightly, her gaze traveling from Beatrice's vibrant suit to her age-defying regal face. Marry? Father? The board? The press? They are expecting a certain profile. Aunt Mi-sun stepped forward, her eyes like twin needles. She didn't look at Beatrice. She looked through her. "Kyung-soo, you have been away too long. The sea air has confused your senses. This woman is older than your late wife was when she passed. She is not of our world." Beatrice stepped forward, breaking the line of the Park family. She didn't wait for an introduction. She walked right up to Misun, her height giving her a slight commanding advantage. "You must be the sister," Beatrice said, her voice a rich, warm hum that seemed to rattle the nearby glass. "Kyung-soo told me you were the guardian of the gates. It's a lovely house, Misun. A bit chilly, though. It feels like a place where people come to stop living." Misun's face paled, her grip tightening on her silk purse. "Our family values discretion and tradition, Miss Wright. We do not care for noise." Beatrice smiled, a slow, predatory flash of white teeth. "Then you're going to find me very exhausting, Misun, because I don't just make noise. I make history." Beatrice turned to the children, her amber eyes pinning them where they stood. "Min Ho, Seo Yon, you can stop staring at my skin and start looking at my eyes. I know exactly what you're thinking, and I promise you, I'm much more expensive than you think I am." She turned back to Kyung-soo, ignoring the gasp behind her. "Kyung-soo, darling, tell the staff to bring my bags to the master suite, and tell them to find some color for these rooms. I feel like I'm standing inside a cloud of ash." As Beatrice walked past them, the glass fortress didn't just feel cold anymore. It felt brittle. The children looked at their father, desperate for him to say it was a joke, but Kyung-soo only adjusted his cufflinks and followed her, a faint, dangerous smile on his face. The storm hadn't just landed, it had moved in. The air in the dairy room, the traditional tea chamber of the Park estate, was thick with the scent of aged cedar and incense, but the atmosphere was as sharp as a razor. This room was Aunt Misun's territory. Here, every movement was a measurement of worth, and every silence was a judgment. Misun sat on the floor with painful grace, her pale handbox spreading around her like the petals of a dying lily. To her left sat Minho and Seo-yeon, looking like two ravens waiting for a carcass. They had invited 3 of the city's most formidable socialites, women who wore their pedigree like armor, to witness the taming of the American woman. When Beatrice entered, she was draped in a vibrant silk-wrapped dress of burnt orange. She moved with a rhythmic swing of her hips that seemed to vibrate against the stillness of the room. "Oh dear," Misun whispered, loud enough for the elders to hear. "She's wearing outdoor shoes on the tatami. It's to be expected, I suppose. The West values speed over sanctity." Beatrice paused, a look of wide-eyed, innocent confusion crossing her face. "Oh, am I doing it wrong? I'm so sorry. Everything is just so quaint here, like a movie set." She kicked off her shoes with a clatter and sat down, intentionally clumsy, tucking her legs in a way that defied the rigid etiquette of the room. Beneath her silk cuff, a small, high-tech recording device, disguised as a chic onyx bracelet, blinked once. Seo-yeon began the ceremony. The dari was a dance of 100 small rules: the height of the kettle, the angle of the wrist, the 3 sips taken in absolute rhythmic silence. "In Korea, Beatrice," Seo-yeon said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "we believe that how a person pours tea reveals the depth of their soul. It takes years of discipline. I imagine it's quite different from the instant culture you are used to." "It's fascinating," Beatrice chirped, leaning in too close, her American boisterousness making the elders recoil. "Back in D.C., we just grab a coffee and go. But please, teach me. I want to be a good wife for Kyung-soo, even if I'm a bit unrefined." Misun exchanged a smug glance with the socialites. Indeed, one cannot buy class, no matter how many houses one claims to have built in the Americas. "Tell me, Beatrice, do you find it difficult to be in a room with people of such ancient lineage? It must feel like a very long climb for someone from your background." "Oh, honey," Beatrice said, fumbling with her teacup so it rattled loudly against the saucer. I don't mind the climb. The view from the top is the same everywhere, isn't it? Though I must say, your tea is a bit weak. Does it get stronger, or is this the tradition, too? The socialites snickered behind their silk fans. Minho leaned in, his voice a low snarl. It's subtle, Beatrice. A concept I'm sure is foreign to you, like the concept of not being a gold-digging opportunist. For an hour, the insults grew bolder. Because they believed Beatrice spoke no Korean and understood nothing of their nuances, the masks fell away. She looks like a circus performer in that color, Misun said in rapid fire, high formal Korean, her eyes fixed on Beatrice with a fake smile. Kyung-soo has truly lost his mind. He has brought a commoner, a person of no heritage, to sit where my mother sat. She is a stain on our floor. Look at her hands, one of the socialites whispered in Korean. They are the hands of a worker. She probably tricked him with some Western magic. We must find a way to dispose of her before the winter gala. Beatrice smiled back, nodding like a bobblehead, her eyes wide and clueless. You all are just so welcoming, Beatrice said in English, her voice bubbly. I can just feel the love in this room. Kyung-soo said you were the most sophisticated people in Seoul. I can't wait to tell him how much you've shared with me today. She stood up, once again nearly knocking over the tea set, and bowed with an exaggerated, messy flourish. I think I'll go find my husband now. This has been so educational. As Beatrice walked out of the room, the laughter of the women erupted behind her, sharp, mocking, and triumphant. They thought they had won. They thought they had broken her spirit by making her a laughingstock. Beatrice reached the hallway and stopped. Her face transformed. The clueless foreigner mask melted away, leaving the cold, terrifyingly sharp features of a woman who had outplayed senators and CEOs. She tapped her onyx bracelet. A small light turned green. Got every word, you arrogant little gnats, she whispered to the empty hallway. She pulled out her phone and sent a file to an encrypted server. Then she smoothed her orange silk dress, held her head high like a queen returning to her throne, and went to find Kyung-soo. The evil aunt had prepared a poisoned tea, but Beatrice was the one who was about to let them choke on it. The transition from the tea ceremony to the daily life of the Park estate was not a transition at all. It was a declaration of war. If the evil aunt, Misun, intended for the house to remain a silent museum of the past, Beatrice Wright intended to turn it into a living, breathing theater of the present. It began at 7 a.m. The head butler, Mr. Kong, was a man who moved with the eerie silence of a ghost. He had been with the family for 30 years, serving as the eyes and ears for Misun and the children. He was currently standing in the doorway of the master suite, holding a tray of gray porridge and lukewarm tea, his face a mask of practiced subservience. The chairman's breakfast, Kang murmured, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of Western disorder. Beatrice, draped in a silk robe the color of a bruised plum, didn't look up from her tablet. Take it back, Kang, and while you're at it, take your bags to the gate. You're fired. The tray rattled. I beg your pardon? I serve the Park family. You are a guest. I am the woman who owns the man who owns this house, Beatrice said, standing up. She walked toward him, her presence filling the room until the air felt thin. And I don't like spies. I saw you whispering into your cuff in the hallway last night, reporting my excessive laughter to Misun. This isn't a boarding school and I'm not a student. You have 10 minutes. When Minho stormed into the foyer 10 minutes later to protest, he found Mr. Kang's trunk on the curb and the front doors wide open, something that never happened in the climate-controlled fortress. You can't do this, Minho roared, his face flushed. He is an institution. He was a parasite, Beatrice replied, leaning over the marble banister. I've replaced him with someone who actually knows how to smile. And Minho? Close your mouth. You're letting the fresh air in." By noon, the disruption had reached its peak. Beatrice had hired a local jazz pianist, a young man with a fedora and a soul for the blues, and had a baby grand piano wheeled into the center of the minimalist atrium. The cold gray stone walls, which usually echoed only with the ticking of clocks, were suddenly vibrating with the syncopated rhythms of New Orleans. She had the heavy, light-blocking drapes stripped from the windows. For the first time in decades, the afternoon sun hit the polished floors with such intensity it made the children squint. "It's vulgar," Seo-yeon hissed, standing in the kitchen as she watched Beatrice show the stunned cooks how to properly season a pot of slow-simmering greens. "She's turned our home into a lounge. It's low class. It's loud. It's vibrant," a voice corrected from the stairs. They all turned. Kyung-soo was descending the staircase. He wasn't wearing his tie. His top button was undone, and for the first time in 20 years, his shoulders weren't hunched toward his ears. He walked into the atrium, watching Beatrice. She was leaning against the piano, laughing. A deep, boisterous, unapologetic sound that cut through the stiff atmosphere of the house like a warm wind. She saw him and beckoned him over. "Kyung-soo, come listen to this boy play. He's got more talent in his pinky than your board of directors has in their entire building." The children watched in horror as their father, the Iron Chairman, actually smiled. He didn't just smile. He laughed back. He took Beatrice by the waist, right there in front of the staff, and kissed her cheek. "The house smells like garlic and music," Kyung-soo whispered, ignoring his children's gasps. "I had forgotten that homes were allowed to have a scent." "It smells like life, Kyung-soo," Beatrice said, her amber eyes shining. "And we're just getting started." As the sun set, the contrast was undeniable. In one corner of the house, Minho and Seo-yeon sat in a darkened study, whispering about reputation damage and psychological evaluation. They saw Beatrice as a wrecking ball, a woman of low breeding who was humiliating their legacy. But in the gardens, Kyung-soo and Beatrice walked hand in hand. For the children, the world was ending. For Kyung-soo, he was finally breathing oxygen after decades of suffocating in the dark. "They're going to try something bigger than a tea ceremony next," Kyung-soo warned, though he sounded more amused than worried. "Let them," Beatrice replied, her voice like velvet steel. "I've always found that the louder the music plays, the harder it is for the snakes to hiss." The rain was a persistent, icy needle against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's library. Inside, the air smelled of old leather and the lingering scent of Beatrice's perfume, a scent Minho found increasingly offensive. It smelled like change. It smelled like the end of his ordered world. He waited for her in the shadows of the walnut-paneled room. He had practiced his posture, his tone, and his expression. He needed to be the crown prince today. Beatrice entered, wearing a silk lounge suit the color of a midnight storm. She didn't look like a woman who had been bullied by a week of icy stares and silent dinners. She looked like she was enjoying a private joke. "Minho," she said, leaning against the doorframe, "you look like you're about to deliver a eulogy. Is the piano music too loud for you today?" "Sit down, Beatrice," Minho said, his voice tight. He didn't use the honorifics. He didn't even use her name with respect. He slid a slim, cream-colored envelope across the desk. "My father is a romantic. He is 71 and vulnerable. You are a clever woman, and I respect the hustle. But the chairman's wife role is closed. This is your exit strategy." Beatrice didn't sit. She walked to the desk with the slow, predatory grace of a panther and picked up the envelope. She pulled out the slip of paper. $5 million. A cashier's check drawn from a private Swiss subsidiary. $5 million, she murmured, turning the check over in her fingers as if it were a curious artifact from a primitive tribe. It's a very clean number, very dignified, as your sister likes to say. It is more than enough for you to retire comfortably in D.C., Minho said, gaining confidence. It is the price of your silence and your immediate departure. You will tell him the culture shock was too much. You will leave tonight. Beatrice didn't look at the amount again. Instead, her eyes narrowed as she studied the routing numbers and the bank's digital watermark at the bottom of the check. A small, chilling smile played on her lips. Bank of Zurich Private Wealth Division, she read aloud. Route 44. That's an interesting choice, Minho. That's the branch usually reserved for emergency liquidity and, how shall we say, unreported personal gains. Minho's composure flickered. The source is irrelevant. The money is real. Beatrice leaned over the desk, her face inches from his. The grandma persona was gone. The loud American was gone. In their place was the CEO, who had liquidated companies twice the size of his. You're using your personal offshore fund, aren't you? The one you opened in the Cayman Islands 3 years ago to hide your bonus discrepancies from your father's auditors. Minho turned ashen. I don't know what you're... Oh, shut up, Minho. It's embarrassing, she snapped. I did a cursory scan of your branch's UK filings this morning while I was having my coffee. Based on this routing number and the current LIBOR rates, your private portfolio is underperforming by at least 4.2% compared to the market average. You're bleeding cash in the London sector, and you're trying to use your shrinking reserves to buy me? She flicked the check back at him. It fluttered onto his lap like a piece of trash. Keep it, honey, she said, her voice dropping into a register of pure, terrifying pity. You're over-leveraged and desperate. You clearly need the liquidity more than I do. $5 million wouldn't even cover the yearly maintenance on my jet. Minho stared at the check, his hands trembling. He looked up at her, and for the first time, he didn't see a foreigner. He saw a predator who had been playing with him like a cat with a terminal mouse. What are you? He whispered. I told you and your sister, Beatrice said, walking toward the door. She stopped and looked back over her shoulder, her amber eyes glowing in the dim light of the library. I am the storm, and you're standing in the middle of it with a paper umbrella. As she walked out, the sound of her laughter echoed down the hallway, mingling with the distant, soulful chords of the jazz piano in the atrium. Minho sat in the dark, the $5 million check clutched in his hand, realizing for the first time that his father hadn't brought home a victim. He had brought home the person who held the keys to all their secrets. The hum of the Park Global boardroom was usually a source of comfort for Minho, but today it felt like the ticking of a countdown. To Minho, his father's absence was an opening. He stood before the board, eyes bloodshot, fueled by the desperate need to prove he was more than just an heir. Aegis Tech is the holy grail of automated supply chains, Minho snapped at the trembling chief legal officer. The patent dispute has depressed the price. It's a bargain we can't ignore. We don't have the liquid capital for an all-cash offer, the CFO reminded him, not with the current reserves. Minho reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a small, obsidian-encrusted key. It was the key to the family's private vault, which held the golden shares, the original equity Kyung-soo had founded the company with 50 years ago. They were more than money. They were the soul of the empire. By the company's bylaws, these shares could be used as collateral in existential emergencies. This is an emergency, Minho declared, his voice trembling with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. I am the acting head of the family. I am authorizing the use of the golden shares to back the loan for the Aegis acquisition. He wasn't just mortgaging the company's future. He was betting the house, the name, and the very ground his father stood on. While Minho's pen hit the paper and soul, Beatrice was 3,000 miles away mentally, sitting on a stone bench in the Mountain Estates garden. Her tablet didn't show news headlines. It showed a level 3 data feed, a direct tap into the global financial plumbing that only top-tier institutions can access. "He's tripped the wire," a voice crackled in her earbud. It was her former chief of staff in D.C. Beatrice watched the screen. A massive block of data moved from a Seoul-based private vault into a London escrow account. To a normal banker, it was just a transfer, but Beatrice had tagged Minho's personal routing numbers days ago. The moment his money moved, her tablet lit up like a Christmas tree. "He's using the golden shares as collateral for Aegis Tech," her chief of staff continued. "Should we intercept the trade?" Beatrice watched a sparrow land on a nearby lantern. She looked at the dark pool volume, the private, invisible market where the real deals happen. She saw sell orders for Aegis being quietly filled by shell companies she recognized. "No," Beatrice said, her voice cold. "Minho thinks he's found a bargain because the public news says there's a patent dispute. He doesn't see the dark pool flow. He doesn't know that Aegis is a zombie company, a hollow shell stuffed with toxic debt. The people I used to have lunch with in London built this trap specifically to catch someone as arrogant and desperate as him. If he signs, the Park Empire becomes legally tied to that fraud," the voice warned. "I know," Beatrice replied, "but if I stop him now, he'll call me a meddler. He needs to feel the floor drop away before he'll ever trust my hand." In London, the Aegis trap snapped shut. The moment Minho's collateral was verified, the secondary debt holders, the people who actually owned the sinkhole that was Aegis, prepared to collect. Minho, back in Seoul, stood on his balcony and raised a glass of brandy. He felt like a titan. He thought he had moved in secret. He had no idea that every digital footprint he left was being tracked on a tablet in his own garden. He didn't know that the anonymous entity holding the other half of the Aegis debt, the only entity that could choose to either pardon the debt or trigger a margin call that would bankrupt the parks, was the woman he had just called a stain at dinner the night before. Beatrice closed her tablet. The trap was set, but she held the only key to the cage. "Checkmate, Minho," she whispered to the wind. "You just haven't realized the game started an hour ago." The morning air in Seoul was brittle, the sky a flat, unblinking gray that seemed to mirror the screens in the Park Global War Room. Minho stood at the head of the table, his tie pulled loose, his knuckles white as he leaned over a mountain of frantic faxes and digital alerts. The victory of the Aegis Tech acquisition had lasted exactly 6 hours. "It's a shell," the CFO whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "The patents don't exist, Minho. The London High Court just froze their assets. They were running a Ponzi scheme disguised as a logistics platform, and we just tied our golden shares to their neck." The black swan had landed. It wasn't just a bad deal. It was a systemic collapse. Because the family's founding shares were used as collateral, the fraud in London had triggered a cross-default clause. By tomorrow's closing bell, the lenders, a consortium of aggressive Western banks, had the right to seize the Park family's controlling interest in the entire empire. 48 hours, the chief legal officer said, his face the color of ash. "Unless we find $2 billion in liquidity to cover the margin call, we lose the company. The chairman has to be told. We need his private reserves." "No," Minho roared, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table. "He's in the mountains. He's with her. If I tell him now, he'll think I'm a failure. He'll give her everything and let the company rot just to spite me. Minho, this is insolvency." "I can find another lender," Minho screamed, though his eyes were wild with the look of a trapped animal. "Seal the floor. No one leaves. If a single word of this reaches the chairman or the press before I find a way out, I will personally see to it that you never work in this hemisphere again." 30 miles away, at the mountain villa, the world was a different color. Kyung-soo was sitting on a cedar deck, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, watching Beatrice paint. She wasn't painting a landscape. She was sweeping bold, aggressive strokes of crimson and gold across a canvas, her movements fluid and rhythmic. The silence was punctuated only by the distant chime of a wind bell. Kyung-soo's phone sat on a small table, its screen dark. He had turned it off at Beatrice's request 3 days ago. "You're thinking about the office," Beatrice said, not looking back from her work. "I am thinking about the silence," Kyung-soo corrected. "It's the first time in my life I haven't heard the hum of the machines." "The machines are still humming, Kyung-soo," she said, pausing to dip her brush into a jar of water. "But you finally realized you aren't the electricity that runs them. You're just the man who owns the switch." She turned to him, her expression unreadable. "What if the switch breaks? Would you still be happy sitting here with me, even if the tower fell?" Kyung-soo looked at her, the woman who had brought color into his gray life. "I spent 40 years building that tower for a family that hates me. If it fell today, I would only be sad for the workers. For myself, I have everything I need right here." Beatrice looked at him for a long, searching moment. She knew. She had seen the alerts on her own encrypted device while Kyung-soo slept. She knew his son was currently drowning in the middle of a shark-infested sea. She knew the black swan was circling the estate. "Good," she whispered, "because the tower is swaying, Kyung-soo." Back in the Gangnam district, Min-ho was a man possessed. He was calling every shadow banker and private equity firm he knew, begging for a bridge loan. But the world had already smelled the blood in the water. "The Americans are refusing to talk," his assistant cried, running into the room. "The group, the ones who hold the primary debt on Aegis. They just issued a formal notice of seizure. They're coming for the golden shares. Min-ho, they're coming at 9 a.m. on Friday." Min-ho collapsed into his leather chair, the weight of his own pride finally crushing him. He looked at the phone. He should call his father. He should confess. But then he thought of Beatrice. He thought of her "I am the storm" speech. He thought of her look of pity in the library. "I will not be saved by her," he hissed to the empty room. "I would rather watch it burn." He didn't know that the fire he was trying to hide was already visible to the only woman who could put it out. And he didn't know that his father was no longer just the chairman. He was the observer, waiting to see if his son would choose the empire or his ego. The clock on the wall ticked with a deafening finality. 47 hours remained. The air at the Park estate was no longer the serene silence of the mountains. It was the suffocating stillness that precedes a landslide. Kyung-soo and Beatrice had returned from the villa early, a quiet tension humming between them that the rest of the household mistook for the usual distance of the elite. Min-ho was a ghost of himself. He paced the stone paths of the inner garden, his phone a permanent fixture in his hand, his eyes bloodshot and darting. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. The billion-won margin call was a ticking bomb in his pocket, and the fuse was burnt down to the nub. Beatrice watched him from the shadows of the veranda. She was draped in a shawl of cream silk, sipping a tea that had gone cold. She didn't need a spy to know what was happening. Her own monitors in D.C. had been screaming market volatility since the London opening bell. She stepped down into the garden, her footsteps light on the gravel. The pebbles usually don't move that much unless the man walking on them is trying to run away from something he can't outpace. Min-ho spun around, his face a mask of exhaustion and raw fury. "Get out, Beatrice! This isn't the time for your riddles." "You're over-leveraged in London, Min-ho," she said, her voice calm, almost clinical. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. Her presence was already overwhelming him. Aegis Tech wasn't a lifeboat. It was an anchor, and right now, the rope is around your neck. Min-ho froze. "How do you— Who told you?" "I told you once. I'm a researcher. I know that Right Global is moving in on your golden shares. I know you have less than 24 hours to find $2 billion. She stepped into the light of a stone lantern. Call off the secondary loan. If you try to bridge this with the Singapore banks, you'll trigger a fraud investigation that will put your father in prison alongside you. I can show you a way to restructure the debt through a private trust. It will be painful, but the company survives. Minho let out a jagged, hysterical laugh. The pressure of the last 2 days finally snapped the thin veneer of his corporate education. All the resentment, the xenophobia, and the wounded pride he had been harboring boiled over into a toxic slurry. You? He spat, stepping toward her, his fingers shaking as he pointed at her face. You want to save me? You're the reason this is happening. My father is so blinded by his midlife obsession with a foreigner that he's let his guard down. He's let a parasite into our bloodline. Beatrice's expression didn't change. Her eyes remained a steady, terrifying amber. Careful, Minho. You're speaking to the woman who is trying to keep your family from the street. You are nothing, Minho roared, his voice echoing off the granite walls of the estate. You are a stain on our history, a black mark on a billion-one empire that has been pure for 60 years. You think because you wear an expensive suit and sleep in the master bedroom that you're one of us? You're a distraction, a gold-digging grandma who needs to stay out of men's business before you get crushed by things your simple mind couldn't possibly understand. The silence that followed was absolute. The wind stopped. Even the insects seemed to hold their breath. That word again. A stain, Beatrice repeated, her voice a whisper of dry silk. And men's business. I see. Is that what you think of the woman I love, Minho? The voice came from the darkened doorway of the library. Kyung-soo stepped out into the garden. He looked older than he had that morning, his face etched with a disappointment so deep it seemed to age him a decade in a single breath. He had heard every word. Father, Minho gasped, his bravado vanishing instantly, replaced by a sickening, childlike terror. I was just stressed. The London branch. I know about London, Kyung-soo said, his voice terrifyingly quiet. He walked past his son, not even granting him the dignity of a glance, and stood beside Beatrice. He took her hand, his grip firm and public. I knew the moment you touched the golden shares. I stayed silent because I wanted to see if you had the character to ask for help, to admit you were out of your depth. I can fix it, Father. I just need... You need nothing, Kyung-soo interrupted. He looked at Beatrice, a silent communication passing between them. Then, he looked back at his son. You called her a stain. You told her to stay out of men's business. Very well. I have made my decision. Kyung-soo turned to Beatrice. Do it. Are you sure, Kyung-soo? She asked softly. He wants to see what men's business looks like, Kyung-soo replied, his eyes cold as the winter sea. Let him see it. Let him see exactly who has been holding his world together. Kyung-soo walked back into the house, leaving Minho standing in the dark. Beatrice looked at the younger man, her face devoid of pity. The margin call is at 9 a.m., Minho, she said, her voice as sharp as a guillotine. I suggest you wear your best suit. It's going to be a long morning. The 24-hour countdown began with a thunderclap of digital notifications. In the high-tech bunkers of Park Global, the screens turned red. Minho and Seo Yeon sat in the center of the chaos, watching as the UK lenders, the ones who held their golden shares, formally sold the debt to a third party. It was a predatory move, a shark maneuver designed to consolidate power before the bankruptcy proceedings could even begin. Who bought it? Minho yelled, his voice cracking. Who has the paper? Seo Yeon hit a key on her laptop. Her face went bone white. Right Global, a private equity firm out of Washington, D.C. They didn't just buy the London debt, Minho. They've been quietly buying up our secondary bonds for the last 48 hours. They own us. They literally own the ground this tower is built on. Minho's heart hammered against his ribs. Right Global was a name whispered in the halls of the World Bank and the IMF. It was led by a figure known only as the Founding Mother, a reclusive genius who had built $1 trillion portfolio by being invisible. She was a ghost CEO, a woman who never did interviews, never appeared on Forbes lists, and moved through the global economy like a silent predator. "We have to get to D.C., Minho said, grabbing his jacket. "We have to beg her to restructure. If she liquidates, we're done." "Wait," Seo-yeon whispered, her eyes glued to an internal memo leaked from the U.S. Embassy. "Look at this. She's not in D.C. She's here, in Seoul. The Founding Mother arrived 4 days ago for what they're calling personal business. She's staying at a private residence." Minho felt a surge of desperate hope. "She's here? In our city? Find her. I don't care if you have to hack the NIS or bribe every concierge in the Gangnam district. If she's in Seoul, I will find her and show her that we are a legacy worth saving." Back at the Park Estate, the atmosphere was unnervingly peaceful. Beatrice was in the library, dressed in a simple, oversized cashmere sweater, sipping a glass of bourbon. She was reading a book of Korean poetry, her feet tucked under her on the velvet sofa. Kyung-soo sat across from her, watching the rain beat against the glass. He knew the world was ending outside those walls, but for the first time in his life, he didn't feel the urge to stop it. "They're looking for the Founding Mother," Kyung-soo said, his voice a low vibration. "The calls are coming into every hotel in the city. Minho is offering 10 million won just for a meeting." Beatrice turned a page. "He's looking for a ghost, Kyung-soo. People like Minho only see what they expect to see. He's looking for a woman in a skyscraper with 1,000 guards. He'll never look at the woman in his living room." "How long will you let him suffer?" Beatrice set the book down. Her eyes were hard, yet there was a flicker of sadness in them. "Until the ego dies. If I save him now, he'll think it was luck. He needs to reach the very bottom, the place where the money doesn't matter and the name doesn't matter. Only then can I build him back up into a man who is fit to lead." Minho and Seo-yoon spent the night in a feverish hunt. They tracked black cars. They called in favors from the Ministry of Finance. They chased shadows across the city. Every lead led to a dead end. The ghost was too fast, too smart. "She's mocking us," Minho hissed, slamming his phone onto the dashboard of his car at 3 a.m. "She's in this city watching us drown, and she won't even give us 5 minutes." "Maybe she's waiting for the margin call," Seo-yeon said, her voice hollow. "Maybe she wants to see the look on our faces when the gavel falls." As the sun began to rise over the Han River, casting a cold pink light over the glass towers of Seoul, Beatrice was downstairs in the estate kitchen, calmly making a pot of coffee for Kyung-soo. "I have a meeting," she said, leaning over to kiss Kyung-soo's forehead. "I know," he replied, taking her hand. "Don't be too gentle." "Gentle doesn't win wars, Kyung-soo," she said, her voice like velvet steel. "And your son needs to learn that the person you ignore is often the person who holds your life in their hands." The morning light in the Park Global Executive Suite was the color of a bruise. Minho sat on the floor. Not the leather chair, but the cold marble floor, surrounded by a sea of shredded documents and empty espresso cups. The silence was the worst part. For years, the telephones had been his pulse, each ring a confirmation of his existence. Now the phones were silent because the world already knew he was a dead man walking. The margin call was 5 hours away. The golden shares, the very atoms of his father's soul, were about to be vaporized. He reached for a fountain pen. His hand shook so violently that the nib scratched the heavy vellum paper. "I, Park Minho, hereby resign." He couldn't even finish the sentence. A sob, jagged and pathetic, escaped his throat. He had wanted to be the son. He had ended up being the shadow that extinguished it. The door to the office didn't click. It swung open with a heavy, deliberate force. Kyung-soo stood there. He wasn't wearing his chairman's suit. He was dressed in a simple black turtleneck and a long wool coat, looking more like a hitman than a mogul. "Get up," Kyung-soo said. His voice didn't contain anger. It contained something far worse: exhaustion. "Father, I was writing the statement. I'll take the blame. I'll tell the press it was all me." "You think the press cares about your apology?" Kyung-soo walked over and looked down at the resignation letter. He picked it up, crumpled it into a ball, and dropped it into the trash. A piece of paper doesn't pay a $2 billion debt. Only power does that. Kyung-soo grabbed Minho by the shoulder, hauling him to his feet. Minho felt like a rag doll in his father's grip. "Where are we going?" Minho stammered, stumbling as Kyung-soo led him toward the private elevator. "To the Shilla," Kyung-soo said, his eyes fixed on the descending floor numbers. "The founding mother of Right Global has agreed to a meeting. She has the golden shares in her hand. She has your life, my life, and the lives of 30,000 employees in her hand." "How? How did you get the meeting?" Kyung-soo looked at his son in the polished mirror of the elevator. "I didn't get the meeting, Minho. She summoned us. She told me she wanted to see the man who thought he was big enough to gamble with a 50-year legacy." The drive through the dawn-lit streets of Seoul felt like a funeral procession. The city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that its greatest titan was about to be decapitated. Minho watched the pedestrians, the office workers, the street cleaners, and felt a sudden, agonizing envy. They were free. He was a prisoner of his own name. "Listen to me carefully," Kyung-soo said as the car pulled into the Shilla Hotel's private underground entrance. "When we go inside, you do not speak unless she asks you a question. You do not negotiate. You do not mention your title. I have found the woman who owns your life, Minho. Now you must do the only thing you have left." Kyung-soo stopped at the entrance to the gold-trimmed elevator that led to the penthouse. He turned to his son, his face a mask of granite. "You must beg." Minho's knees buckled. "Father, please. I'm a Park. I can't." "You are a child who lost his father's house," Kyung-soo hissed. "You have no name until she gives it back to you. Now, straighten your tie. Look like a man, even if you're about to crawl." The penthouse floor was silent, guarded by 4 men in suits so sharp they looked like obsidian. They didn't check IDs. They simply stepped aside as Kyung-soo approached. They knew him. More importantly, they seemed to be waiting for him. The air in the hallway smelled of cedar and an expensive, familiar scent. Minho's heart was drumming against his ribs so hard it was a physical pain. He felt the weight of the $2 billion like a mountain on his back. Kyung-soo paused at the double mahogany doors. He took a deep breath, and for a split second, Minho saw a flicker of something in his father's eyes. It wasn't fear. It was a strange, terrifying kind of pride. "Inside this room," Kyung-soo whispered, "is the truth. I hope you're strong enough to hear it." He pushed the doors open. The room was bathed in the pale, blue light of the morning. A massive desk sat in front of a window that overlooked the entire city. A high-backed leather chair was turned away from them, facing the horizon. On the desk sat a single silver tray containing the original golden share certificates, the ones Minho had lost in London. "Madam," Kyung-soo said, his voice echoing in the vast space, "I have brought the boy." Minho didn't wait. He didn't even look at the chair. He collapsed to his knees on the thick Persian rug, his head bowed, his voice trembling. "Please," Minho cried out, the words spilling from his soul, "take my personal assets. Take my future. Jail me if you must. But do not destroy my father's work. It wasn't his fault. I was arrogant. I was blind. Please, have mercy on the Park Global name. The chair began to turn, slowly, deliberately. Mercy is a very expensive commodity, Minho, a voice replied. It was a voice that didn't belong in a skyscraper. It was a voice that belonged in his kitchen, in his garden, in his father's arms. Minho's head snapped up. The silence in the Shilla penthouse was so heavy, it felt as if the oxygen had been sucked from the room. Minho remained on his knees, his forehead nearly touching the plush rug, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. He was a broken prince, waiting for the executioner's blow from the ghost of D.C. The high-backed leather chair completed its slow, mechanical revolution. You're trembling, Minho, the voice said. It's a poor look for a man who was so loud in the garden 3 nights ago. Minho's head snapped up. His neck felt as if it might snap. The woman sitting behind the massive slab of black marble was not the distraction his father had brought home from a cruise. She was not the foreigner he had tried to bribe. She sat framed by the rising sun, draped in a charcoal pinstripe power suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan. A string of black Tahitian pearls sat against her throat like a collar of midnight. Her silver hair was no longer soft. It was swept back into a sharp, lethal blade. Beatrice? The name died on his lips, a pathetic wheeze of disbelief. To you, she said, leaning forward into the light, her amber eyes turning into molten gold. I am Madam Wright, the woman who just spent $2 billion to buy back the soul of your family because you were too busy protecting your pride to protect your company. Minho scrambled back, his hands scraping against the carpet as he tried to find his feet, but his legs refused to hold him. He looked at the silver tray on the desk. There they were. The golden shares. The literal foundation of the Park Empire, lying casually next to her crystal glass of sparkling water. You are Wright Global? Minho stammered. The founding mother? But the cruise, the cooking, the music. I built an empire out of nothing while your grandfather was still selling textiles out of a cart, Minho, Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a register of terrifying authority. She stood up. She didn't just rise. She seemed to expand, filling the room until the floor-to-ceiling windows felt too small to contain her. You called me a stain, she said, walking slowly around the desk. The click of her heels against the marble border of the room sounded like the cocking of a pistol. You told me to stay out of men's business. You judged me by the color of my skin and the years on my face, never once stopping to wonder how a woman like me could afford to wander the world alone. Kyung-soo stood by the door, his arms crossed. He didn't look triumphant. He looked like a man watching a forest fire clear out the dead wood. Father, Minho turned to him, his voice a sob. You knew all along. I knew who she was, the moment we touched the shore, Kyung-soo said quietly. But she asked me for a favor. She wanted to see the true heart of the heirs I had raised. She wanted to see if you were worthy of the steel she was ready to bring into this family. Beatrice stopped in front of Minho. She reached down, her black pearls swinging, and picked up the golden share certificates. She held them out to him, but she didn't let go when he reached for them. I didn't buy these to destroy you, Minho, she whispered, her gaze pinning him to the spot. I bought them because your father asked me to save his son from his own stupidity. But hear me now. I am not a distraction. I am the person who owns the debt on your very existence. If you ever speak to me or any woman with that tone again, I won't just liquidate your branch. I will erase your name from the history of this city. She let go of the shares. They fluttered into Minho's shaking hands, weightless paper that now felt like lead. Minho looked down at the documents, then up at Beatrice. The shock was fading, replaced by a crushing, soul-deep realization. He hadn't just insulted his father's girlfriend. He had insulted the only person on the planet with the brilliance, the ruthlessness, and the capital to save the Park global legacy. He had called the architect of his salvation a stain. Minho's voice failed him. He bowed. It wasn't the shallow, polite bow of a businessman. He went all the way to the floor, his forehead pressing against the cold marble. I am a fool. Madam, please, forgive my ignorance. Beatrice looked down at him for a long beat. Then, she looked at Kyung-soo and gave a small, weary nod. Get up, Minho, she said, her voice regaining a hint of that honey and gravel warmth. The bank's open in 2 hours. We have a lot of men's business to fix, and you're going to be the one carrying my bags. The aftermath of the reveal was not a celebration. It was a reconstruction. The boardroom of Park Global, usually a theater of ego, had been transformed into a classroom of high-stakes reality. Minho and Seo-yeon sat at the far end of the long obsidian table, looking less like executive directors and more like chastened students. At the head of the table sat Beatrice, a pair of reading glasses perched on her nose, her fingers flying across a tablet as she dismantled the tangled web of the London debt in real time. Kyung-soo stood by the window, his back to them, watching the morning fog lift from the Han River. You think I was cruel, Kyung-soo said, his voice reflecting off the glass. You think I let you dangle over the edge of a cliff just for a theatrical reveal. Father, we almost lost everything, Seo-yeon whispered, her voice still trembling. Kyung-soo turned, his eyes harder than the marble floor. You lost nothing that wasn't already hollow. I knew about the London gamble the hour Minho signed the papers. I could have stopped it with a single phone call, but if I had, you would have gone on believing that you were untouchable. You would have gone on judging the world by its cover, never realizing that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you've decided to ignore. He stepped toward the table, gesturing to Beatrice. I didn't bring Beatrice here to be your mother. I brought her here because I love her, and she is the only person I know who can teach you how to survive a world that doesn't care about your family name. Beatrice looked up from her screen, her gaze cool and level. Your father has signed over his voting proxy to me for the next 30 days. As of 9 a.m., you are both stripped of your titles. Minho, you are no longer the head of international logistics. Seo-yeon, you are no longer the VP of strategy. Minho gasped. Then what are we? Interns, Beatrice said, the corner of her mouth twitching. You will report to me at 6 a.m. every morning. You will fetch the data, you will verify the ledgers, and you will listen. If you survive the month without complaining, you get your offices back. If you don't, I liquidate your shares, and you can go find dignified work elsewhere. Minho looked at his father, pleading, but Kyung-soo simply sat down and opened a newspaper. The message was clear. The chairman had left the building. The ghost was in charge. The first week was a brutal education. Beatrice didn't lead with speeches. She led with math. Minho watched in stunned silence as she sat on a call with the Singaporean creditors. They had come into the meeting like wolves, ready to tear into the Park legacy. Within 20 minutes, Beatrice had cited 3 obscure maritime regulations and a private tax loophole that effectively neutralized their leverage. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She spoke with the quiet, terrifying confidence of a woman who had seen the bottom of every ledger in the Western world. How did you see that? Minho asked, leaning over her shoulder as the call ended. The tax discrepancy. It was hidden in a footnote. I don't read the story they want to tell me, Minho, Beatrice said, not looking up. I read the story. The numbers are trying to hide. People lie. Line items don't. By the second week, Seo-yeon found herself staying late with Beatrice, eating takeout tteokbokki on the floor of the office while they mapped out a new strategy for the U.S. branch. My mother always told me to be quiet, so I wouldn't make mistakes, Seo-yeon confessed, watching Beatrice highlight a flaw in the new corporate charter. Beatrice paused, her pen hovering over the paper. She looked at Seo Yeon, and for the first time, the CEO mask softened. Being quiet isn't a strategy, honey. It's a hiding place. I made 1,000 mistakes on my way up. The difference is, I owned them before they could own me. You have a good mind, Seo Yeon. Stop trying to be dignified and start trying to be right. The stepmother bond didn't form through hugs or sentimental dinners. It formed in the trenches of a corporate war. It happened when Minho caught a mistake in a contract and brought it to Beatrice, expecting a rebuke, only to have her nod and say, "Good catch, Park. You're starting to see the invisible." It happened when Seo Yeon stood up to her Aunt Misun in the hallway, defending Beatrice's changes to the company's hiring policy, saying, "She's not changing our culture, Auntie. She's giving us a future." By the end of the month, the children didn't look at Beatrice and see a stain or a foreigner. They saw a titan. They saw the steel that their father had been trying to find for them his entire life. One evening, as they were packing up, Minho hesitated at the door. "Beatrice, I'm glad my father found you. Not just for the company, for us." Beatrice didn't look up from her tablet, but a small, genuine smile touched her lips. "Get some sleep, kid. We have a merger to announce tomorrow. And wear the blue tie. It makes you look like someone who knows what they're doing." As they left, Kyung-soo emerged from his office. He looked at Beatrice, who was finally leaning back in her chair, exhausted but triumphant. "They passed," he said. "They did," she agreed. "They're still arrogant, and they still have a lot to learn. But they've stopped looking at the cover, Kyung-soo. They're finally reading the book." The morning of the wedding, Seoul didn't wake up to its usual monochromatic haze. A rare, brilliant sky stretched over the city, as if the atmosphere itself had been scrubbed clean for the occasion. At the Park estate, the silence of the glass fortress had been permanently evicted. In its place was a beautiful rhythmic chaos. Hairdressers navigated around trunks of vibrant African wax prints, and the smell of spicy jollof rice from the kitchen clashed magnificently with the delicate aroma of steaming taeok. The Seoul Cathedral was a marvel of architectural history, but inside it had been transformed into a living tapestry. On the left side of the aisle sat the stoic, black-suited elite of the Korean business world, men and women who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the impassive face. On the right sat Beatrice's tribe, DC power brokers, Atlanta entrepreneurs, and a boisterous collection of extended family whose laughter echoed off the vaulted stone ceilings. Then the music started. It wasn't a somber organ processional. A gospel choir, flown in from Chicago and dressed in robes of shimmering gold, began a low, rhythmic hum that built into a crescendo of soulful power. The sound was so visceral, so thick with joy, that even the most hardened Korean CEOs found themselves sitting up straighter, their feet tapping against the ancient marble floors despite themselves. Kyung-soo stood at the altar. He looked younger than he had in 20 years, dressed in a traditional black gat and a duramagi embroidered with subtle silver threads. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at the back of the church. The doors swung open. Beatrice didn't walk alone. In a final, public declaration of the family's healing, she walked down the aisle with Minho on her left arm and Seo Yeon on her right. She was a vision of global royalty. Her gown was a masterpiece, a fusion of a traditional Korean hanbok silhouette with a train made of hand-woven kente silk from Ghana. Her silver hair was adorned with a simple, elegant bignyo, a traditional hair ornament, but her pearls remained around her neck, a reminder of the ghost who had saved them all. As they reached the altar, Minho took Beatrice's hand and placed it firmly into his father's. He didn't pull away immediately. He leaned in and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on us, Mother." The ceremony was conducted in two languages, a symphony of Korean and English that spoke of more than just a marriage. It spoke of a merger of souls. I spent my life building walls to keep the world out, Kyung-soo said, his voice steady and clear. I thought safety was found in silence, but you taught me that a house without music is just a tomb. You didn't just come into my life, Beatrice. You liberated it. Beatrice smiled, her eyes brimming with a warmth that the ghost of DC had long kept hidden. I've spent my life being the strongest person in every room, Kyung-soo. I never thought I'd find a man who could stand in the middle of my storm without blinking. We aren't just two people getting married. We're two empires realizing they're better together. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the gospel choir erupted into a jubilant rendition of "Oh Happy Day." The colorful Park family processed out of the church, a blur of silks, satins, and smiles, breaking every rule of traditional Korean decorum and loving every second of it. The reception was a legendary affair, featuring a buffet that moved from galbi to fried catfish, and a dance floor where Aunt Misun was spotted, to everyone's shock, being led into a two-step by a senator from Maryland. But as the night began to fade into the early hours of the morning, the two titans slipped away. They stood on the wide granite balcony of the Namsan estate. The party hummed below them, a distant, happy vibration. The cold, gray minimalism of the house had been replaced by warmth. The stain had become the soul of the home. Kyung-soo wrapped his arm around Beatrice's waist, pulling her close. The city of Seoul lay at their feet, its neon lights beginning to dim as the first sliver of the sun broke over the horizon. The tower is still standing, Kyung-soo remarked, nodding toward the distant Park Global headquarters. It's standing on better ground now, Beatrice replied, resting her head on his shoulder. Your children are awake. The company is honest. They stood in silence as the sky turned from deep violet to a soft, hopeful gold. The empire in peril was gone. In its place was a new dynasty, one built on the strength of a woman who refused to be small and a man who was brave enough to let her be great. As the new sun rose over Seoul, the two titans finally let out a long, shared breath. They weren't just the chairman and the CEO anymore. They were home. The end. Thank you for watching. If you loved this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more emotional twists and character-driven plots. And if you're ready for the next story, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, keep believing in love that defies all odds.